The sinking of the RMS Titanic is without doubt the most famous maritime catastrophe to date, and although the tragic night of April 14, 1912 was over 100 years ago, the talk of Titanic has far from faded. But over the years, there have been many questions asked and concerns raised about that fateful night. So, from the supposed unidentified suicide on board, to the incredible premonitions by many that something bad was going to happen, here are some of the many unanswered questions, legends and conspiracies surrounding the now most famous liner to have ever sailed. The Switch. This theory claims that the ship that sank wasn't in fact Titanic, but her sister ship RMS Olympic, and it was all part of an elaborate insurance scam. This is the most widespread conspiracy, and over the years there has been some interesting evidence to support, but since it's still a conspiracy, not exactly confirm that this is what happened. On October 20th, 1910, Olympic, the first of the White Star Line's 3 superliners, was launched and immediately held the record for the heaviest ever man-made object. Her first 4 Atlantic trips were successful, but on the 20th of September 1911, on her 5th Atlantic voyage, Olympic collided with the Royal Navy cruiser HMS Hawke. At the helm of the Olympic that day was none other than Captain E.J. Smith, who had gone to captain the Titanic. There were no injuries, and both ships managed to stay afloat, but the damage to Olympic's hull was severe. It took 2 weeks just to make her seaworthy enough for her to return to Belfast, where she had to undergo a further 6 weeks of repairs. By November 1911, Olympic was back in service, but suffered another setback the next year, when she lost a propeller blade and again had to go back to Belfast to be fixed, delaying Titanic's launch date. As with all naval collisions, an inquiry was launched, and since the Olympic was at fault, the cost of the repairs would not be covered by their insurance. Facing financial ruin, it's claimed that with the help of the builders, the White Star Line decided to switch Olympic with Titanic, whose already delayed completion would be delayed further by having to repair Olympic a second time. They quickly patched up Olympic, and instead of Titanic setting out on her eagerly anticipated maiden voyage on April 1912, it was the Olympic. That is the story, and in a controversial book written by Robin Gardner called The Ship That Never Sank, it's claimed there is enough evidence to suggest that this was the case, and this isn't a wild conspiracy. Gardner points out that the external profile of both ships was practically identical, and standard White Star issue, apart from a few differences such as the personal lifeboats, the bow and nameplates, that all could have been swapped over a weekend. Gardner suggests that because the Olympic was almost beyond repair, by patching her up and staging a sinking, they could collect the insurance money supposedly for Titanic and recoup their losses. However, if this was the case like the conspiracy suggests, why did they allow so many people to die, and why were not more lifeboats fitted if they had intended to sink the ship? Well, again, Gardner has a theory on that. He claims the ship did not hit an iceberg, as we are led to believe, but instead the seacocks were opened, allowing water in to slowly flood the ship, and that numerous ships were strategically stationed nearby to be able to rescue all the passengers, without the need for more lifeboats. He claimed that high-ranking officers were aware of the plan, including Captain Smith and First Officer Murdoch, but the plan backfired when the ship hit one of the rescue ships. As for the original Titanic, he alleges that she spent 25 years in service as the Olympic, until she was scrapped in 1935. Of course, however plausible this may sound in theory, there are many flaws. For the switch to be possible, a lot of people would have had to be silenced, including thousands of Belfast ship workers, the crew, along with some passengers who were bound to have noticed the difference in the ship, and who wrote of hitting an iceberg and not a ship. Why was her designer, Mr. Andrews, aboard, as was the chairman, Joseph Ismay? Would they have wanted to be aboard knowing the plan to sink her? Probably the biggest flaw in the switch theory is that it's reported the Titanic was underinsured by $2.5 million, so would it have been worth taking such a huge risk when the money they would recoup would not have covered their mounting debts? I will leave that up to you to decide. William McMaster Murdoch, the villain, and his suicide. On the journey to safety on the Carpathia, the boat that picked up many Titanic survivors, there was talk among passengers of an officer who committed suicide on the boat deck and shot at frantic people just before the Titanic sank. No official name was ever mentioned, although the suicide has long been associated with a man by the name of William McMaster Murdoch, first officer of the Titanic. This was strengthened after James Cameron's 1997 film, where Murdoch is characterised as a man who is having trouble coping with the chaos and shoots passengers before committing suicide. But just how true is all this? And has Murdoch been posthumously blamed for things that simply are not true? Was he in fact a true hero who should be regarded as such? For starters, Murdoch was put in charge of the starboard evacuation after the collision, and he launched 10 lifeboats, being responsible for saving 75% of the eventual survivors. The reports that Murdoch shot 2 men as they tried to storm the lifeboats, and that he later shot himself, is unsubstantiated and quite possibly completely false. Officer Lightoller, who survived the sinking, described in a letter to Murdoch's wife the final moments of her husband's fate, stating he was assisting people and that the reports as to the ending are absolutely false, saying Mr. Murdoch died like a man, doing his duty. There is also a lot of debate about whether Murdoch took the right course of action when faced with the iceberg, and if he hadn't taken the evasive action to avoid the iceberg and hit it head on instead, the ship may not have sunk. This could potentially be true, but iceberg collisions were not part of training, and a serious accident with one was almost unheard of, so Murdoch would not have known to hit it straight on. At that moment, he took the action that he thought was the right thing to do. The way Murdoch has been portrayed in films and TV has upset his family, as in the aftermath of the sinking, he was a hero in the eyes of the people of his hometown in Scotland. James Cameron acknowledged that Murdoch had not been portrayed in a good light, and he and his studio executives issued an apology. But what about the hundreds of eyewitness testimonies of a man committing suicide and shooting passengers? Well, in potentially ruling out Murdoch, if the letter to his wife was not to ease her suffering, we are still left with one of the darkest Titanic mysteries. Just who committed suicide during the final chaotic moments? With all the reports, it seems that someone most likely did, but with no evidence to connect the dots, we most likely will never know who. The myths. There is so much confusion over what is true and what is a myth regarding the sinking of the Titanic, so I want to look at a few of the most believed stories surrounding the disaster under one topic, and try and separate the facts from fiction. It's long been believed the Titanic was aiming to claim the Blue Ribbon Prize, an award to the liner that could make the fastest crossing of the Atlantic, and that Captain Smith was instructed to pick up an excessive speed that meant she could not avoid colliding with the iceberg. This one is a myth. The fact is, Titanic was designed for luxury and not speed. She would never have been able to match the speeds of the Lusitania or Mauretania, and the White Star Line knew that, as Titanic was at least 2 knots slower than the fastest liners. Another myth is the fact the Titanic was regarded as the unsinkable ship. Over the years, this has been commonly told, and that White Star Line promoted her as such. But according to documents, the White Star Line never made any such claims, at least not officially. In fact, Titanic was not as big a news at the time of her maiden voyage, because her sister ship, the Olympic, had already stolen all of the limelight. If Titanic hadn't have sunk, she would most likely have been of little significance in the course of history. Captain Smith, who has been portrayed as a hero, and although most definitely went down with his ship, failed to heed the ice warnings and did not slow Titanic down when he was made aware of the obvious danger. These failures in his duty, and his delay in issuing passengers with the order to abandon ship, meant many passengers did not realise the danger they were in, and lifeboats were being launched half full. Subsequent thoughts about Captain Smith indicate he became disorientated and traumatised when faced with the reality of the unfolding disaster, and his failures in command and lack of clear orders for evacuation meant a lot of the blame for the sinking of the Titanic has been attributed to him. However, whilst he was being named a hero for going down with the ship, James Ismay, the White Star Line president, was being portrayed as a coward, a power-mad bully who pushed the captain to drive the ship too fast, and who during the sinking jumped into a lifeboat ahead of women and children. However, the truth is, at the official inquiry into the sinking, it was recognised that Ismay had helped many passengers into lifeboats before jumping into the last lifeboat to leave. If he hadn't have jumped, he would have inevitably lost his life. He didn't take anyone's place in the lifeboat, merely instinctively jumped in to save himself, as no one else had got in. Ismay never got over the shame of saving himself, and was instrumental and generous in sorting out insurance claims for the victims' families, as well as donating large amounts of money to charitable organisations later in his life. But ultimately he was a broken man, and forever lived under the radar of newspapers, who refused to associate him with anything but a coward. Was the Titanic cursed? Perhaps one of the most enduring myths about the Titanic is that she was cursed due to the cargo she was carrying, and this one deserves a talk on its own. It's long been alleged and debated that she was carrying the mummy of Princess Amun-Ra, the Egyptian princess who lived around 95 BC, and when she died was buried in a wooden coffin in a deep vault in Luxor, Egypt. In the late 1890s, 4 wealthy English gentlemen were invited to Luxor with a view to purchase the lavishly decorated mummy case, which, as far as the rumour goes, had been separated from the remains of the princess. One of them paid several £1,000s for the coffin and had it delivered to his hotel, but just a few hours later he was spotted walking out into the desert and was never seen again. The next day, one of the other men in the group was shot in the arm and had to have it amputated. The other 2 returned home to England, and one of them discovered the bank holding all his money had failed and he was bankrupt. The 4th man suffered a debilitating illness and ended up on the streets. Despite these misfortunes, the coffin finally found its way to England, where it was purchased by a London businessman, who, after his house burned down and his family were terribly injured in an accident, donated it to the British Museum. However, as the coffin was being unloaded at the museum, the truck carrying her apparently suddenly moved backwards and trapped a passerby. After the coffin was finally safely installed in the Egyptian room at the museum, it was reported that at night hammering and sobbing could be heard coming from the casket, and night watchmen and cleaners refused to go near it. The museum authorities decided to move the mummy into the basement out of view, but within a week of the move, the supervisor was supposedly found dead at his desk, and one of the helpers had fallen seriously ill. The museum decided to sell the coffin to a private collector, and due to evil energy, the collector was advised to get rid of it as soon as possible. Although with her reputation now well known, no museum would take the coffin, so eventually an American archaeologist paid a handsome sum for her and dismissed the ill fortune as coincidence. He arranged for the mummy to be shipped across to his hometown of New York, and boarded a ship along with his new treasure in April 1912. That ship was, of course, the RMS Titanic. The wooden coffin was then apparently rescued after the accident and put back on display in the British Museum of London. All the bad luck surrounding the coffin is said to be true. However, if it was on the Titanic and then rescued, and this could have cursed the ship like many still believe, is up for some serious debate, as there are no definitive records of it ever being on board. What's your thoughts? Titanic premonitions. On the night of April 14th, 1912, a young girl called Jessie Sayer lay dying in her bed in her hometown of Kirkcudbright, Scotland. In her delirious state, she recounted seeing a large ship sinking and a man playing the violin called Wally, a nickname for Wallace. Within hours of her death, Wallace Hartley was playing his violin with the rest of his band as Titanic sank. This seemingly premonition was not a single event. In the aftermath of the sinking, several passengers came forward with claims they had visions of imminent disaster and decided against booking a ticket. Unfortunately, some did not change their mind, despite the visions of something bad happening. Anne Ward was the 35-year-old maid of the Cardezza family, and it was claimed she told her mother before the voyage that she did not want to go. She could not explain why, as she had made the same trip across the ocean on other occasions, but this time she had a fear that something was going to happen. When the ship began to sink, Anna was rescued along with her employer, Mrs. Cardez. First-class passenger Major Archibald Willingham Butt had such a strong feeling that he would not return home from his trip on the Titanic. He contacted his lawyer to put all his affairs in order in preparation for his death. He perished in the sinking, and his body was never recovered. Eva Hart was 7 years old at the time of the sinking. She survived and often talked about her recollection of her experience in Titanic-related activities. She claimed that her mother sat up every night when she was aboard Titanic, as she was afraid to sleep as she thought there would be an accident. Mr. William Thomas Stead was a well-known but controversial English newspaper editor of the Victorian era, and often claimed his death would be caused by either lynching or drowning. In an irony that almost predicted his own fate, he wrote 2 articles, one published on the 22nd of March 1886, called How the Main Steamer Went Down in Mid-Atlantic by a Survivor, which was about a steamer that collides with the ship, with many lives lost due to an insignificant amount of lifeboats. The other published in 1892, and was called From the Old World to the New. It was about a ship called the Majestic that goes to the rescue of another ship that has struck an iceberg. Stead went down with the Titanic, and his body was never recovered. It wasn't just the passengers that had a bad feeling about the Titanic though. Chief Officer Henry Tingle wrote a letter to his sister that said, "I still don't like this ship. I have a queer feeling about it. Tingle was thought to have last been seen swimming towards a lifeboat before dying of hypothermia. Also, the mother of John Hume, the ship's violinist, pleaded with her son not to board the Titanic, as she had a premonition that something bad was going to happen. Hume still boarded the ship, and along with the rest of the crew's orchestra, went down with the Titanic. One must wonder why there were so many people who had premonitions of the Titanic disaster before it took place, and I would love to hear your thoughts on why you think this was. So, that's 5 conspiracies, mysteries and tales surrounding the RMS Titanic, the grandest ship to have ever sailed.